The bitter wind carried the scent of approaching snow as Rose Anderson clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, desperation burning in her eyes as she paced the muddy main street of Elmwood Springs. Her stomach growled fiercely, reminding her that it had been 2 days since she'd eaten anything more substantial than the few wild berries she'd managed to forage on the outskirts of town. The year was 1876, and the Colorado winter showed no mercy to those without means. "Shawl for sale," Rose called out, her voice growing hoarser with each attempt. "Hand-woven wool shawl." Few townsfolk even bothered to look her way, hurrying past with collars turned up against the cold. Those who did spared her only pitying glances before quickening their pace. Rose had arrived in Elmwood Springs just 3 days prior, after the stagecoach she'd been traveling on was robbed by bandits who'd taken everything of value she possessed, including the small pouch of coins that represented her entire life savings. The stagecoach company had continued on its route, unable or unwilling to assist a penniless passenger, leaving her stranded in this unfamiliar mining town with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's shawl. The shawl, her most cherished possession, was the last gift her mother had given her before succumbing to consumption the previous winter. The delicate pattern of blues and purples had been painstakingly hand-woven by her mother over many months. Parting with it felt like losing a piece of her heart, but hunger was a powerful motivator. "Please," she said, approaching an older woman exiting the general store. "Would you be interested in purchasing this fine shawl? It's well-made and warm." The woman eyed the worn edges of the garment skeptically. "Doesn't look worth much to me, girl. Besides, I've got plenty of my own." She walked away without another word. Rose blinked back tears of frustration. At 22, she had never imagined finding herself in such dire circumstances. After her mother's death, she'd sold their small farm in Missouri and set out for California, where her mother's sister lived. The journey west was supposed to be the beginning of a new life, not this desperate struggle for survival. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Rose's hope diminished. The few coins she might get for the shawl would barely buy enough bread to last a day, but it was her only option. Her fingers were numb with cold as she approached the bakery, determined to try one last time before the shop closed for the day. The warm, yeasty aroma wafting from the bakery made her stomach cramp painfully. Through the window, she could see golden loaves stacked in neat rows. Rose swallowed hard and pushed open the door, setting off a small bell that announced her entrance. "We're closing soon," the round-faced baker called out without looking up from his task of wiping down the counters. I was hoping to sell this shawl," Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need bread." The baker glanced up, his expression immediately softening as he took in her haggard appearance. "I'm sorry, miss. I don't need a shawl, but I can spare a heel of bread if you're hungry." Before Rose could respond, the bell chimed again as the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the imposing figure of a man. Rose instinctively stepped aside, clutching her shawl to her chest. "Evening, Mr. Nichols," the baker greeted. "The usual." "Make it a double order today, Frank," the newcomer replied, his voice deep and resonant. "The boys at the ranch are hungry after moving cattle to the winter pasture." Rose glanced at the man from beneath her lashes. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical ranching attire denim trousers, a well-worn sheepskin coat, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face. When he removed his hat, she saw that he had dark blonde hair and a strong, clean-shaven jawline. He couldn't have been more than 30 years old. "Yes, sir, Mr. Nichols. I'll wrap that right up," the baker said, reaching for brown paper. While the baker busied himself, the rancher's attention turned to Rose. His blue eyes widened slightly as he assessed her condition, the mud-spattered hem of her dress, the hollowness in her cheeks, the desperate grip on the shawl in her hands. "Madam," he acknowledged with a slight nod. Rose felt heat rising to her cheeks, embarrassment at her circumstances warring with the instinctive pride that kept her chin lifted. "Sir," she replied quietly. The baker returned with a large package wrapped in paper. "That'll be 85 cents, Mr. Nichols." As the rancher reached for his wallet, Rose gathered her courage. "Excuse me, sir," she said, stepping forward. "I don't mean to impose, but would you perhaps be interested in purchasing this shawl? It's finely made and quite warm." The man Nichols studied her for a long moment before his gaze dropped to the shawl she held out. Rose was acutely aware of how it must look, with its frayed edges and faded colors, but it was still a beautiful piece of craftsmanship if one looked closely enough. "What's your price?" he asked, his expression unreadable. Rose hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. $2, she ventured, knowing it was worth more but desperate enough to accept less. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition of her desperation, perhaps, or simple pity. "What's your name?" "Rose Anderson, sir," he nodded once. "I'm Drew Nichols. I own the Silverleaf Ranch about 10 miles east of town." He reached into his wallet and pulled out several bills. "I'll give you $5 for the shawl." Rose's breath caught. $5 would buy enough food to last her a week or more if she was careful. "That's too generous, Mr. Nichols. The shawl isn't it's worth what I'm willing to pay," he interrupted firmly. He handed the money to the baker. "Frank, give Miss Anderson whatever food she needs, up to $5 worth. Put it on my account if it goes over." The baker nodded, looking impressed. "Right away, Mr. Nichols." Rose stood stunned, the shawl still clutched in her hands. "I don't know what to say." "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." Drew Nichols shrugged. "No need for thanks. It's getting colder by the minute, and that shawl looks like it might come in handy." He glanced toward the window where fat snowflakes had begun to fall. "Where are you staying in town?" Rose's silence answered for her. Drew frowned. "You don't have a place." "I was robbed on my way here," Rose explained, reluctant to share too much of her circumstances with a stranger. "I was hoping to find work, but so far." Drew considered this information while the baker bustled about, filling a basket with bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "Town's not the safest place for a woman alone," he said finally. "Especially with no lodgings. The mining camp boys get rowdy at night." Rose knew he was right. She'd spent the previous 2 nights huddled in the doorway of the abandoned milliner's shop, jumping at every sound. "My sister-in-law runs the house at Silverleaf," Drew continued. "We could use extra help with cooking and cleaning, especially now that winter's setting in." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "It's honest work, Miss Anderson, room and board plus wages." Rose's heart leaped at the prospect of shelter and regular meals, but caution tempered her excitement. "Why would you offer employment to a complete stranger, Mr. Nichols?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Let's just say I have a good sense for people. You don't strike me as someone looking for charity, just an opportunity." He held her gaze steadily. "And frankly, my sister-in-law is expecting a baby in the spring. She could use the help." The baker returned with a basket heaped with provisions. "Here you are, miss. This should keep you fed for a few days." Rose looked from the food to Drew Nichols and back again, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept the job," Drew replied. He nodded toward the window where the snow was falling more heavily now. "My wagon's outside. If you're coming to Silverleaf, we should leave now before the roads get worse." Rose took a deep breath. She had no reason to trust this man, but something in his straightforward manner reassured her. And the alternative, another night on the streets in worsening weather, held little appeal. "Very well, Mr. Nichols, I accept your offer." Drew nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good." He reached for the shawl still clutched in her hands. "May I?" Reluctantly, Rose surrendered her mother's shawl. To her surprise, Drew didn't simply take it instead. He shook it out and draped it around both their shoulders, drawing her close to his side. "Temperatures are dropping fast," he explained, his voice gruff with what might have been embarrassment. "We've got a cold ride ahead. Better to share warmth." Rose's heart hammered in her chest at the unexpected proximity. She could smell leather and pine and something uniquely masculine that she presumed was simply Drew Nichols himself. The breadth of his shoulders beneath the shared shawl made her feel small and oddly protected. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to meet his eyes. Drew nodded curtly, as if he too was uncomfortable with the intimacy of their position. "Let's go. Storm's not waiting." They stepped out into the swirling snow, still huddled together beneath the shawl. Rose clutching her basket of food, Drew carrying his parcels of bread. His wagon waited at the hitching post, a sturdy team of horses stamping impatiently in the gathering snow. "It's about an hour's drive in good weather," Drew explained as he helped her up to the high seat. "Might take longer tonight." As they pulled away from town, Rose cast one last glance at the bakery window, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. That morning, she had been alone and starving, with nothing but a cherished shawl and dwindling hope. Now she rode beside a stranger who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than she had experienced in months, headed toward an uncertain future but one that at least promised shelter and food. The shawl, still draped around them both, fluttered slightly in the wind. Drew reached up with one hand to secure it more firmly, his fingers briefly brushing against Rose's shoulder. The touch, though fleeting, sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fabric sheltering them from the storm. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft huffing of the horses as they plodded steadily through the thickening snow. Rose found herself studying Drew Nichols' profile from the corner of her eye, the strong line of his jaw, the way his brows furrowed slightly in concentration as he guided the team. "You mentioned you were robbed," Drew said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Where were you headed before that happened?" Rose hesitated, then decided there was no harm in sharing her story. "California. My aunt lives in Sacramento. After my mother passed last winter, I sold our farm in Missouri and decided to make a fresh start out west." Drew nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry about your mother." "Thank you." Rose clutched the basket of food tighter in her lap. "The stagecoach was attacked just outside of Elmwood Springs. The bandits took everything, my money, my luggage, even my mother's locket." Her voice caught on the last words. "Likely the Harlow gang," Drew said, his voice hardening. "They've been plaguing this area for months. Sheriff's too afraid to go after them." "I reported it, but the sheriff seemed uninterested in helping." Drew made a sound of disgust. "Sheriff Tate's more concerned with keeping the mining companies happy than protecting ordinary folk." He glanced at her, his blue eyes reflecting concern. "You're lucky they didn't hurt you." Rose shuddered, remembering the rough hands that had yanked her from the coach, the leering faces as they'd rifled through her belongings. "One of them wanted to. Take me with them," she admitted quietly. The leader stopped him, said they didn't have time. Drew's hands tightened on the reins. "Bastards," he muttered. Then, seeming to remember himself, he added, "Pardon my language, Miss Anderson." Despite everything, Rose found herself smiling slightly. "I grew up on a farm, Mr. Nichols." "I've heard worse." This earned her a brief chuckle from Drew, the sound surprisingly warm in the cold air. "Still, my mother raised me better." The mention of his mother prompted Rose to ask, "Have you lived in Colorado long?" Drew nodded. "Born and raised." "My father started Silverleaf Ranch after fighting in the war. When he passed 5 years ago, my brother Thomas and I took over." A shadow crossed his face. "Thomas died last year, thrown from a horse. Now it's just me and his widow, Margaret." "I'm sorry for your loss," Rose said softly, understanding all too well the pain of losing family. Drew acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "Maggie's strong. She's kept everything running smoothly at the house, but with the baby coming." He trailed off. "We've had a hard time finding help. Most women in these parts are either already married or working in the saloons." Rose recognized the unspoken implication that respectable female help was scarce. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Nichols. I ran our farm with my mother for years after my father died. I can cook, clean, mend, and I learn quickly." "Never doubted it," Drew replied. "Wouldn't have offered otherwise." As they continued their journey, the snow fell more heavily, blanketing the landscape in white. Rose found herself leaning closer to Drew beneath the shared shawl, seeking both his warmth and the strange sense of security his presence provided. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to rely on anyone else. "How large is Silverleaf?" she asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from her awareness of him. "About 2,000 acres, Drew answered. "Mostly cattle, but we keep some horses too. There's a main house where you'll stay with Maggie, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, stables, and a few outbuildings." Pride colored his voice as he spoke of his home. "It's not fancy, but it's good land." "It sounds wonderful," Rose said sincerely. Drew glanced at her, seeming to search her face for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious features and made him look younger, more approachable. "I think so too." The shared moment stretched between them, warm despite the frigid air. Then Drew cleared his throat and returned his attention to the road ahead. "We'll be crossing Willow Creek soon. After that, it's just another few miles to the ranch." The creek, swollen with early winter rains, rushed beneath a wooden bridge that creaked ominously as the wagon rolled across. Rose gripped the seat tightly, her knuckles white. "Bridge needs replacing," Drew commented. "One more thing to add to the spring list." "Do you manage all the ranch work yourself?" Rose asked. "I have 5 hands who help with the cattle and horses. Good men, all of them." "You'll meet them at supper." Drew adjusted his grip on the reins. "Though they might be a bit tongue-tied around you at first, it's been a while since we've had a young woman at Silverleaf." Rose felt heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm sure they'll be perfect gentlemen," she said primly. Drew chuckled again. "They will be, or they'll answer to me." There was something comforting about his casual protectiveness, Rose thought. In the span of a few hours, her situation had changed so dramatically, it was almost difficult to process. This morning, she'd been contemplating which alleyway might provide the best shelter from the weather. Now she was headed toward a home, employment, and the company of people who already seemed disposed to treat her with kindness. "There it is," Drew said suddenly, pointing ahead through the curtain of snow. "Silverleaf." Rose peered through the gathering dusk and falling snow. In the distance, warm lights glowed from the windows of a substantial 2-story home nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. Nearby stood several smaller buildings, the bunkhouse and stables Drew had mentioned, she presumed. Even through the storm, Rose could make out the sweeping vista of ranch land that surrounded the buildings, rolling away toward distant mountains. "It's beautiful," she breathed, genuine admiration in her voice. Drew's expression softened as he looked at his home. "It's been in our family for 30 years. My father named it Silverleaf for the aspens that grow along the eastern boundary. In the fall, they turn silver and gold." A note of pride entered his voice. "There's no place like it." As they drew closer to the main house, Rose could see more details: a wide porch wrapped around the front, smoke curling from 2 stone chimneys. Sturdy log construction with larger windows than she would have expected in such a remote location. Everything about it spoke of permanence and care. A woman appeared on the porch as the wagon pulled up, one hand resting protectively on the gentle swell of her belly beneath her apron. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and despite her obvious pregnancy, she moved with brisk efficiency as she came to greet them. "Drew Nichols, what in heaven's name kept you so long?" she called out, concern evident in her voice. "I was about to send Hank out to look for you." "Sorry, Maggie," Drew replied as he set the brake and jumped down from the wagon. "Got delayed in town." He turned to help Rose descend, his strong hands encircling her waist as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground. Margaret Nichols' eyebrows rose as she took in the scene. Drew and Rose still partially wrapped in the shared shawl, the basket of provisions clutched in Rose's arms. "And who might this be?" she asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. "This is Miss Rose Anderson," Drew explained. She's going to help around the house like we discussed. He quickly related the circumstances of their meeting, tactfully omitting the details of Rose's desperate situation. Margaret's expression softened immediately. "Well, Miss Anderson, you've certainly picked a dramatic night to arrive," she smiled warmly, "but you're most welcome. We've been praying for help, haven't we, Drew?" Drew nodded, looking somewhat uncomfortable with his sister-in-law's direct reference to prayer. "Maggie runs the house," he explained to Rose. "You'll be taking your direction from her." "I understand," Rose said, turning to Margaret. "I'm very grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Nichols." "Please call me Maggie, everyone does," she gestured toward the house. "Come inside before you both freeze solid. Drew, take care of the team and then come in for supper. It's been keeping warm." Drew nodded and moved to tend to the horses while Maggie ushered Rose toward the welcoming light of the house. As they reached the porch, Rose glanced back to see Drew watching them, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. When he caught her looking, he quickly turned away, busying himself with the wagon. Inside, the house was blessedly warm, heated by a substantial fireplace in what appeared to be a combined kitchen and dining area. The furniture was simple but well made, the floors covered with colorful rag rugs that added both warmth and cheer to the practical space. The aroma of beef stew filled the air, making Rose's stomach growl audibly. Maggie laughed. "Sounds like you're ready for supper. But first, let me show you where you'll be staying. You can wash up and change if you'd like." She led Rose up a narrow staircase to a small but clean bedroom at the back of the house. A simple iron bed covered with a patchwork quilt dominated the space, accompanied by a washstand with pitcher and basin, a small chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. "It's not much," Maggie said, lighting the lamp on the bedside table, "but it's private and warm." "It's perfect," Rose replied honestly, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of a real bed after nights spent on hard ground. Maggie smiled, one hand absently rubbing her rounded belly. "There's clean water in the pitcher, and I'll find you something to change into after supper. We're about the same size, or at least, I was before this little one started growing." She patted her stomach affectionately. Left alone, Rose set down her basket of food and slowly explored her new room. The window overlooked the ranch yard, where she could see Drew still tending to the horses, his movements efficient despite the falling snow. Beyond him, lights glowed in what must be the bunkhouse, suggesting the other ranch hands were settling in for the evening. Rose turned to the washstand and poured water into the basin, grateful for the chance to wash away the grime of her difficult days in town. As she splashed the cool water on her face, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror hanging above the stand. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her normally vibrant auburn hair hung limp around her face. She looked exhausted and haunted hardly the capable helper she had promised to be. "It will be better now," she whispered to her reflection, trying to convince herself as much as anything. "You have a chance here. Don't squander it." After making herself as presentable as possible, Rose made her way back downstairs to find Maggie setting the table for supper. Without being asked, she moved to help, gathering spoons and placing them beside the bowls Maggie had already set out. "Thank you," Maggie said, looking pleased. "It's nice to have another pair of hands around here." The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air as Drew stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots before removing them at the door. His cheeks were reddened from the cold, his hair damp with melted snowflakes. "Animals are all settled," he reported, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. His eyes found Rose, and something in his expression shifted subtly. "You look rested." "Thank you," Rose replied, feeling a strange flutter in her chest at his notice. "Your sister-in-law has been very kind." "Maggie's the kindest woman in Colorado," Drew agreed, earning a snort from his sister-in-law. "Flatter all you want, Drew Nichols, but you're still on dish duty tonight," Maggie retorted, though her tone was affectionate. Drew laughed, a full, rich sound that transformed his serious face. "Worth a try." Rose couldn't help but smile at the easy banter between them. There was clearly deep affection and respect in their relationship. Speaking to the kind of household, this was one built on care rather than mere obligation. Supper was a simple but hearty affair of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple preserves. Rose hadn't realized just how hungry she was until the first spoonful passed her lips. She had to consciously restrain herself from eating too quickly, aware of both Drew and Maggie's occasional glances. "So, Miss Anderson," Maggie said as they ate, "Drew mentioned you were traveling to California." Rose nodded, setting down her spoon. "My aunt lives in Sacramento. After my mother died, I thought a fresh start might be best. And now," Drew asked quietly, "will you still go to California?" The question hung in the air between them. Rose considered it carefully. "I don't know," she admitted. "I lost everything in the robbery, including my mother's locket, the only keepsake I had of her. The money from the farm is gone. Starting over in California seems daunting now." "Well, you're welcome here as long as you wish to stay," Maggie said firmly. "Especially with the baby coming in the spring, I'll need all the help I can get." "When are you due?" Rose asked, glad for the change in subject. "April, if the midwife's calculations are correct." Maggie's expression softened as she placed a hand on her belly. "Thomas never knew about the baby. He died just a few weeks before I realized I was expecting." Drew's expression darkened at the mention of his brother. "Thomas would have been over the moon," he said quietly. "He always wanted a big family. He'll watch over this little one from heaven," Maggie said with quiet conviction. She turned to Rose. "Do you have any family besides your aunt?" Rose shook her head. "No, it was just my mother and me for many years. My father died of pneumonia when I was 12. "You're too young to have faced so much loss," Maggie observed sympathetically. "I'm 22, Rose replied. "Old enough to have learned that life rarely goes according to plan." Drew studied her across the table, his blue eyes thoughtful. "You've got grit, Miss Anderson, that'll serve you well out here." Coming from him, the simple assessment felt like high praise, and Rose found herself warming under his approving gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Nichols." "Drew," he corrected. "If you're calling Maggie by her first name, you might as well use mine too." "Drew," Rose repeated, testing the name on her tongue. Somehow, the simple act of speaking his given name felt significant, as if a barrier had been crossed. After supper, true to Maggie's decree, Drew tackled the dishes while Rose helped clear the table. Maggie, looking tired, excused herself to rest in the parlor with her mending. Working alongside Drew in the comfortable kitchen, Rose felt a curious sense of rightness, as if she had found her place in the world after months of drifting. Drew was methodical in his dishwashing, his large hands surprisingly gentle with Maggie's china. "Thank you," Rose said suddenly, breaking the companionable silence that had settled between them. Drew glanced at her, one eyebrow raised in question. "For everything," she clarified. "The food, the job, the room. For believing in me when you had no reason to." Drew was quiet for a moment, focusing on the plate in his hands before setting it carefully on the drying rack. "When I was 17, he said finally, "I got caught in a blizzard while checking fence lines. Would have frozen to death if a stranger hadn't found me and taken me in. Old trapper named Jed Wilson," he shrugged, as if embarrassed by the personal revelation. "Sometimes folks need help, nothing more to it than that." But Rose sensed there was more, that Drew Nichols was a man who carried a deep sense of responsibility, not just to his family and his land, but to the wider principles of decency and compassion. It was evident in the way he spoke, in the respect he showed both his sister-in-law and Rose herself. "Still," she persisted, "not everyone would have done what you did." Drew turned to face her fully then, his expression serious. "Maybe not, but I'm glad I did." His gaze held hers steadily. "You don't strike me as someone who gives up easily, Miss Anderson. I respect that." "Rose," she corrected softly, "if I'm to call you Drew." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Rose, then." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither seemed ready to name. Then Drew cleared his throat and returned to the dishes. Tomorrow, Maggie will show you around the house, get you familiar with the routine here. It's not complicated, but every household has its own ways. Of course, Rose agreed, gathering herself. I'm eager to be useful. Drew nodded, seemingly satisfied. The storm's likely to keep us all close to home for a day or two. Once it clears, I'll show you the rest of the ranch if you're interested. I'd like that very much, Rose replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Later that night, tucked into the first real bed she'd slept in for days, Rose listened to the howl of the wind outside her window. The shawl, her mother's shawl, now technically Drew's property, was folded carefully on the chest at the foot of her bed. Drew had handed it to her before she retired for the night, saying simply, "This belongs with you." Rose had tried to protest, to remind him that he'd paid good money for it, but he'd been adamant. "Consider it part of your welcome," he'd said. "Besides, it's special to you, I can see that." His perceptiveness had touched her deeply. Few people in her experience had bothered to look beyond the surface, to see what mattered to her. As she drifted toward sleep, Rose found herself thinking of Drew's strong hands securing the shawl around them both, of the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled, of the quiet authority he carried without arrogance. In the span of a single day, he had become someone important to her, a protector, an employer, and perhaps, someday, a friend. Outside, the Colorado winter raged, but within the walls of Silverleaf Ranch, Rose Anderson had found an unexpected sanctuary. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear, her dreams peaceful beneath her mother's shawl. The morning brought brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow, transforming Silverleaf Ranch into a dazzling wonderland. Rose woke early, accustomed to rising with the dawn from her farming days. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before memory flooded back the desperate attempt to sell her shawl, Drew's timely intervention, the journey to this place that already felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since her mother's death. Climbing from the warm bed, Rose shivered slightly in the cool air of the bedroom. She dressed quickly in clothes Maggie had provided the night before, a simple brown skirt and cream-colored blouse that fit reasonably well, despite being a bit loose in the waist. After splashing her face with water from the basin and tidying her hair into a practical bun, Rose made her way downstairs, guided by the scent of coffee and frying bacon. She found Maggie already at work in the kitchen, humming softly as she tended to breakfast preparations. The older woman looked up with a warm smile as Rose entered. "Good morning, I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Rose admitted. "Thank you again for everything." Maggie waved away her thanks. "We're the ones who should be grateful. Having another pair of hands around here will be a blessing." She gestured toward the stove. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Rose gratefully accepted the offer, pouring herself a cup of the strong brew. "May I help with breakfast? You could set the table," Maggie suggested. "Drew's already out with the men, checking for any damage from the storm, but they'll be in shortly for breakfast. We feed the hands breakfast and dinner here in the main house." Rose busied herself with setting places at the large oak table that dominated one end of the kitchen. As she worked, she asked Maggie about the daily routine at Silverleaf, eager to understand her new responsibilities. "Mornings are usually busiest," Maggie explained. "Breakfast for the men, then cleaning, baking, laundry, whatever needs doing that day. Afternoons are sometimes quieter, though there's always mending or preserving or something that needs attention." She rubbed her lower back unconsciously. "Lately, I've found myself needing to rest more often, which is why Drew was so keen on finding help." "I'm happy to take on whatever tasks you need," Rose assured her. "On our farm, my mother and I did everything ourselves, so I'm no stranger to hard work." Maggie smiled approvingly. "I can see that about you. There's a competence in the way you carry yourself." She paused, studying Rose. "If you don't mind my asking, what happened to your plans for California? Drew mentioned you were headed there when you were robbed." Rose sighed, arranging the last fork beside a plate. "My aunt lives in Sacramento. After my mother died, I sold our farm and planned to start fresh out west. But now, she shrugged, with no money and no belongings, it seems like an impossible journey. Nothing's impossible with the Lord's help, Maggie said gently, though sometimes his plan for us isn't what we expected. Before Rose could respond, the back door burst open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the sound of men's voices. Drew entered first, followed by 4 other men of varying ages. They stomped snow from their boots and hung their coats on pegs by the door, their faces reddened from the cold but their expressions cheerful. Drew's eyes found Rose immediately, a slight smile warming his features. "Morning, sleep well." Rose nodded, suddenly self-conscious under the curious gazes of the other men. "Very well, thank you." Drew turned to his ranch hands. "Boys, this is Miss Rose Anderson. She'll be helping Maggie around the house." His tone carried a subtle warning as he added, "I expect you all to show her the same respect you show Mrs. Nichols." The men nodded, murmuring greetings as Drew introduced them one by one. Hank, the grizzled foreman with weathered features and kind eyes; Miguel, a skilled horseman with a quick smile; young Billy, barely 20 and clearly in awe of Drew; and Charlie, a middle-aged former soldier with a pronounced limp. "Pleased to meet you, madam," Hank said, speaking for the group. "Any friend of the boss is welcome at Silverleaf." "Thank you," Rose replied, warming to their obvious sincerity. "I'm happy to be here." "Breakfast is ready," Maggie announced, setting a platter of fried eggs and bacon on the table. "Sit down before it gets cold." The men needed no second invitation, taking their usual places at the table with the easy familiarity of a well-established routine. Drew gestured for Rose to take the chair beside him, opposite Maggie at the head of the table. The meal was a lively affair, with the men discussing the previous night's storm and the work that needed doing to repair minor damage to one of the corrals. Rose was struck by the easy camaraderie between Drew and his men. They clearly respected him, but there was none of the tense deference she had observed in other working relationships. Drew listened to their opinions, asked questions, and considered their suggestions with genuine interest. After breakfast, the men headed out to begin their day's work. Drew lingered briefly, helping Maggie clear the table despite her protests. "Storm didn't do as much damage as I feared," he told them. "But that bridge over the creek needs attention sooner rather than later. Hank and I will ride out to assess it this morning." "Be careful," Maggie cautioned. "That creek runs fast and deep after a snow." Drew nodded, his expression softening as he regarded his sister-in-law. "Always am." He turned to Rose. "Once the bridge is secured, I'd still like to show you around the ranch if you're interested." "I'd like that," Rose replied, pleased by the invitation. After Drew departed, Rose spent the morning learning the rhythms of the household from Maggie. They washed dishes, kneaded dough for the day's bread, and tackled the weekly laundry, working together in companionable harmony. Rose found Maggie easy to talk to, practical, warm, and refreshingly direct. "How long have you been at Silverleaf?" Rose asked as they hung sheets to dry on lines strung across the back porch, protected from the snow by the overhanging roof. 5 years, Maggie replied. "I met Thomas when I was teaching at the schoolhouse in Elmwood Springs. He courted me for nearly a year before I agreed to marry him." A wistful smile crossed her face. "He was persistent, Thomas was. Said he knew from the first moment he saw me that I was meant to be his wife." "You must miss him terribly," Rose said softly. Maggie nodded, one hand resting automatically on her growing belly. "Every day. But I have his child to look forward to, and Drew's been a rock through everything." She secured a clothespin on a pillowcase before adding, "He took Thomas's death hard, blamed himself though there was nothing he could have done." "Blamed himself? Why?" "They'd argued that morning," Maggie explained. "Something about which pasture to move the herd to. Drew wanted Thomas to wait for the hands to help, but Thomas was always impulsive. Went out alone and tried to cut astray from the herd. His horse spooked at something and threw him." She sighed deeply. "Drew found him, too late to do anything but bring him home. Rose's heart ached at the image of Drew discovering his brother's body. How awful for both of you. It nearly broke him, Maggie said quietly. He's only recently started to come back to himself. Taking on more responsibilities, making plans for the ranch's future again. She gave Rose a meaningful look. Bringing you here was the first impulsive decision I've seen him make since Thomas died. Rose felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm sure he was just being kind. Maggie's expression was knowing. Drew is always kind, but he's rarely impulsive. He must have seen something special in you. Before Rose could formulate a response, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Drew and Hank were riding back into the ranch yard, their horses kicking up sprays of snow. Even from a distance, Rose could see the tension in Drew's posture, the grim set of his mouth as he dismounted. Something's wrong, Maggie murmured, abandoning the laundry to hurry down the porch steps. Rose followed close behind. Drew met them in the yard, his expression dark. Bridge is worse than I thought, won't hold a wagon and barely safe for riders. We're essentially cut off from town until repairs can be made. How long will that take? Maggie asked, concern evident in her voice. Few days at least. Creek's running too high to work safely right now. Drew ran a hand through his hair in frustration. We have supplies enough, but I don't like being isolated, especially with your condition. Maggie placed a reassuring hand on his arm. I'm fine, Drew. The baby isn't due for months yet. Drew nodded, though he didn't appear entirely convinced. His gaze shifted to Rose. I'm sorry about this. Wasn't planning on trapping you here when I offered you the position. I don't feel trapped, Rose assured him honestly. I'm grateful to be here, bridge or no bridge. Something in Drew's expression eased at her words, the tension around his eyes softening slightly. Well, since we're all stuck here together, I might as well give you that tour I promised. He glanced at the sky where clouds were beginning to gather again. Though we'd better make it quick, looks like more snow coming. Maggie shooed them away. Go on then, I've kept Rose busy all morning. She's earned a break and I could use one myself. Drew disappeared briefly to fetch an extra coat for Rose, a weathered sheepskin similar to his own but smaller, presumably once belonging to Maggie. It'll be warmer than that shawl, he explained as he helped her into it. The coat enveloped Rose in its weight and warmth, the lingering scent of leather and pine surprisingly comforting. Thank you, she said, buttoning it up against the chill. Drew led her first to the stables, a solid structure housing about 20 horses in comfortable stalls. The interior was surprisingly warm, protected from the winter cold by thick walls and good construction. These are our riding stock, Drew explained, moving down the center aisle where curious equine faces peered out at them. We keep the working horses and breeding stock in the south pasture during good weather, but most are in the lower barn now for winter. He stopped at a stall housing a beautiful chestnut mare with a white blaze. The horse nickered softly and stretched her neck over the door, clearly expecting attention. This is Penny, Drew said, stroking the mare's velvety nose. Gentlest horse we have. She'd be a good mount for you if you'd like to ride sometime. Rose approached cautiously, extending her hand to let the mare sniff her. She's beautiful. When Penny nudged her hand demandingly, Rose laughed, and apparently very friendly. She knows a soft touch when she sees one, Drew remarked, watching Rose with the horse. You've ridden before. Rose nodded. We had horses on our farm, nothing as fine as these, but I'm comfortable in the saddle. Good to know. Drew seemed pleased by this information. Not much use being on a ranch if you can't ride. From the stables, they continued to the bunkhouse, a long, low building where the ranch hands lived. Drew showed her only the common room, explaining with a hint of awkwardness that the sleeping quarters beyond weren't suitable for a lady's inspection. Not that they're unclean, he hastened to add. Maggie insists on regular washing of bedding and such, but men living together. He shrugged, letting the sentence hang. I understand, Rose assured him, amused by his discomfort. They visited the smokehouse, the root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables from the summer's garden, and the blacksmith shop where the ranch's tools were maintained and horseshoes forged as needed. Throughout the tour, Drew spoke with obvious pride about Silverleaf, detailing its operations and history with the enthusiasm of a man deeply connected to his land. As they walked toward the main corral, where Miguel and Billy were working with a young horse, Rose found herself studying Drew's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes squinted slightly against the winter sun, the confident set of his shoulders. In just over 24 hours, he had transformed her life, offering safety and purpose when she had nearly lost hope. "Why did you really help me?" she asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could reconsider it. Drew glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. "What do you mean, in town? You could have just given me a coin for bread or even just purchased the shawl and been on your way." Rose hesitated, then pressed on. "Instead, you brought me here, offered me work, a place to stay. Why?" Drew was quiet for a long moment, his pace slowing as he considered her question. Finally, he sighed. "Honest answer, I'm not entirely sure myself." He stared out across the snow-covered pasture. "When I saw you in that bakery, something just, I don't know, felt right about helping you." He rubbed the back of his neck, seeming uncomfortable with the admission. "You had dignity, even when asking for help, pride without arrogance," he shrugged. "Reminded me a bit of my mother, actually." The comparison startled Rose. "Your mother?" Drew nodded. "She was from back east. Well-educated, used to finer things. When she married my father and came west with him, she faced hardships she'd never imagined, but she never complained, never lost her grace." His expression softened with memory. "She just rolled up her sleeves and learned what needed learning." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Drew's gaze returned to Rose, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I think she would have liked you." The simple statement felt like high praise coming from him. Rose ducked her head, unsure how to respond. They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds their boots crunching in the snow and the distant calls of Miguel directing Billy in the corral. Finally, Drew spoke again, his tone more businesslike. "Bridge aside, you should know that winters here can be isolating. Snow often makes travel difficult, even when the bridge is sound. If you're uncomfortable with that, come spring, I'd be happy to help you continue on to California, perhaps escort you partway myself." The offer was generous, yet Rose found herself strangely reluctant to consider it. "Thank you," she said carefully. "But I'd like to take things one day at a time if that's all right. See how I fit here at Silverleaf." Drew nodded, something like relief flickering across his features. "More than all right." He gestured toward the main house, where smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. "We should head back. Those clouds are moving in fast." As if punctuating his words, the first snowflakes began to fall, delicate crystalline structures that danced in the air before settling on the already white ground. Rose tilted her face upward, enjoying the cool touch of snow on her skin. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "So peaceful." Drew's expression warmed as he watched her. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "it is." The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Rose quickly adapted to the routines of Silverleaf, rising early to help prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, assisting Maggie with household tasks throughout the day, and gradually assuming more responsibilities as she proved her competence. Maggie, clearly grateful for the help, began teaching Rose the specific skills needed to manage the ranch house, everything from rendering lard to the precise way Drew preferred his shirts ironed. The broken bridge remained impassable, isolating them from town but creating an intimate atmosphere at the ranch. Evenings were spent in the warm kitchen or the cozy parlor, with Drew often reading aloud from one of the many books that lined the shelves while Maggie worked on baby clothes and Rose mended shirts or darned socks. Sometimes the ranch hands would join them, with Miguel playing guitar and teaching them Mexican folk songs, or Charlie recounting carefully edited stories from his army days. Throughout these quiet evenings, Rose found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Drew to his strong hands holding a book, the deep cadence of his voice as he read, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally brightened his serious features. More than once, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, one that sent warmth spreading through her chest. On the 5th day after her arrival at Silverleaf, Rose was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when Maggie entered with an armful of mending. The men spotted riders approaching from the east, Maggie reported, settling herself in a chair by the window. Drew thinks it might be Sheriff Tate. Rose tensed slightly at the mention of the sheriff. Her encounter with him after the stagecoach robbery had left her with little faith in the man's interest in justice. "I wonder what brings him all the way out here in this weather," she murmured, punching down the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. "Probably just checking on isolated homesteads after the storm," Maggie suggested, "though he rarely bothers himself with such concerns." She glanced at Rose. "Drew mentioned you had an unpleasant experience with the sheriff when you reported the robbery." Rose nodded grimly. "He took my statement, but made it clear he had no intention of pursuing the matter. Said the Harlow gang was too dangerous to confront over a woman's trinkets, as he put it." Maggie's expression hardened. "Typical. Sheriff Tate collects his salary and does as little as possible to earn it." She shook her head disapprovingly. "Thomas used to say Tate's spine was made of jelly." The sound of voices outside interrupted their conversation. Moments later, the back door opened, admitting Drew, Sheriff Tate, and a third man Rose didn't recognize, tall and thin, with a neat beard and city clothes beneath his heavy coat. "Maggie, Rose," Drew acknowledged them, his expression uncharacteristically tight. "Sheriff Tate has news from town." Tate nodded curtly to the women. He was a barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache and small, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Nichols," he greeted Maggie, before his gaze settled on Rose with a flash of recognition. "Miss Anderson, wasn't expecting to find you here." "Miss Anderson is employed at Silverleaf now," Drew said firmly, moving to stand subtly between Rose and the sheriff. "Is that so?" Tate's tone suggested skepticism. "Interesting coincidence, then, that we've come about her." Rose felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "About me? Why?" The third man stepped forward, removing his hat. "Perhaps I should introduce myself. Walter Blackwell, attorney for the Western Stage Company." He fixed Rose with a cool stare. "Miss Anderson, you were a passenger on the Elmwood Springs stage when it was robbed last week, correct?" "Yes," Rose confirmed warily. "I reported the incident to Sheriff Tate immediately afterward." "So you did," Tate agreed. "What you failed to mention was your involvement in the robbery. The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing." Rose felt the blood drain from her face. "My what?" "That's absurd," Drew snapped, his stance protective beside Rose. "What possible evidence could you have for such a claim?" Blackwell reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "We have a sworn statement from one of the other passengers, a Mr. James Wilson. He claims he observed Miss Anderson speaking with one of the robbers in a familiar manner, and that she appeared unsurprised by the attack." "That's a lie," Rose exclaimed, her hands still covered in flour from the bread dough. "I'd never seen those men before in my life." Mr. Wilson also states that while other passengers lost only money and valuables, Miss Anderson's luggage was removed intact, suggesting prior arrangement. Blackwell continued implacably. "My belongings were stolen just like everyone else's," Rose protested, struggling to comprehend this nightmarish turn of events. "They took everything I had, did they?" Sheriff Tate's mustache twitched skeptically. "Yet here you are, comfortably situated at one of the region's most prosperous ranches. Quite a stroke of luck for a penniless robbery victim." Drew took a step toward Tate, his expression dangerous. "Careful, Sheriff. You're coming dangerously close to insulting a woman under my protection." Maggie rose from her chair, one hand supporting her pregnant belly. "This is outrageous. Rose came to us with nothing but the clothes on her back and a shawl she was trying to sell for bread money. Does that sound like someone who profited from a robbery?" Perhaps she had a falling out with her accomplices, Blackwell suggested smoothly. Or perhaps this was her designated safe haven after the crime. How dare you? Rose's shock was giving way to anger. I have never broken the law in my life. I was a victim of that robbery, not a participant. Sheriff Tate shrugged. Be that as it may, I have a sworn statement implicating you. I'm obliged to take you to town for questioning. You'll do no such thing, Drew said quietly, his voice carrying a steel edge that Rose had never heard before. Not without actual evidence beyond the word of one dubious witness. The law, Tate began. Don't speak to me of law, Drew interrupted. When have you ever enforced it fairly? The Harlow gang has terrorized this region for months while you've done nothing. Careful, Nichols, Tate warned. Obstructing justice is a serious offense. So is harassment and false accusation. Drew didn't back down. Who is this James Wilson anyway? I've never heard of him. Blackwell and Tate exchanged glances. He's a businessman from Denver, Blackwell said. He left Elmwood Springs the day after the robbery. How convenient, Maggie remarked dryly. And why has the stage company suddenly taken such interest in this particular robbery? Stages get robbed frequently in these parts with minimal investigation. The company has investors to answer to, Blackwell replied stiffly. Recent losses have been significant. Rose's mind was racing, trying to make sense of this bewildering situation. There was no James Wilson on that stage, she said suddenly, certainty crystallizing as she mentally reviewed the other passengers. There was an elderly couple, a mining engineer and a young mother with her child, no businessman from Denver. Sheriff Tate's expression hardened. Are you calling me a liar, Miss Anderson? I'm saying someone is lying, Rose replied steadily. And it isn't me. Drew moved to stand fully beside Rose now, his presence solid and reassuring. I think it's time for you gentlemen to leave. The bridge to town is damaged, as you well know, having crossed it. It won't be safe to return until tomorrow at the earliest. You're welcome to bunk in the foreman's cabin tonight. We can resume this discussion when you have actual evidence. For a moment it seemed Sheriff Tate might argue, but something in Drew's unwavering stance appeared to give him pause. Fine, he conceded grudgingly. But this matter isn't settled, Nichols. If Miss Anderson runs, it'll be on your head. She's not going anywhere, Drew said firmly. Except perhaps to Sacramento come spring, if she still wishes to. After the men had departed for the foreman's cabin on the far side of the property, an uncomfortable silence fell in the kitchen. Rose stared down at her flour-covered hands, feeling suddenly uncertain of her place in this household she had so quickly come to think of as home. They're lying, she said quietly. I don't understand why, but that statement is completely fabricated. There was no James Wilson on that stage. We believe you, Maggie assured her immediately, crossing to place a comforting hand on Rose's arm. Drew's expression was troubled as he paced the kitchen. The question is why? Why target you specifically? What would the stage company gain? Insurance, Maggie suggested. If they could prove the robbery was an inside job involving a passenger, perhaps they wouldn't have to pay claims to the other victims. Possibly, Drew agreed, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Or perhaps. He trailed off, his brow furrowed in thought. Perhaps what? Rose prompted. Drew hesitated before answering. The timing is suspicious. The Harlow gang has been operating for months without serious pursuit from Tate. Now suddenly there's interest in one specific robbery and a convenient scapegoat. He met Rose's eyes. What exactly did the bandits take from you? Besides money and the locket you mentioned. Nothing of particular value, Rose replied, confused by the question. Some clothes, a few books, letters from my mother. She paused, remembering. Oh, and the deed to our farm in Missouri, not that it matters now, the sale was completed before I left. The deed, Drew repeated, his expression sharpening. Was it in your name? Yes, my father left everything to my mother and she left it all to me. Drew and Maggie exchanged significant looks. Land deeds can be altered, Maggie said slowly. Especially if they're for property in another state where verification would be difficult. You think someone wants my farm? Rose asked incredulously. It's just a small plot in Missouri, barely profitable even in good years. Unless there's something valuable about it that you don't know, Drew suggested. Mining rights, perhaps? Railroad access? Rose considered this possibility. The railroad did approach my mother about purchasing a right-of-way through our property last year. She refused because their offer was too low. She shook her head in disbelief. But surely they wouldn't resort to robbery and false accusations. Money makes people do terrible things, Maggie observed grimly. Especially when large corporations are involved, Drew nodded his agreement. The stage company's lawyer being here with Tate suggests this goes beyond a simple robbery investigation. Someone's pulling strings. His jaw set determinedly, but they've made a critical error in targeting you. What's that? Rose asked. The ghost of a smile touched Drew's lips. They didn't count on you being under the protection of Silverleaf Ranch. He turned to Maggie. Send one of the boys to fetch Judge Wilson from the Henderson place. He's been staying there since the bridge to town washed out last month. Maggie nodded, understanding immediately. Drew's right. Judge Wilson is circuit court justice for this region and no friend to corporate interests or incompetent sheriffs. If anyone can get to the bottom of this, it's him. As Maggie left to relay Drew's instructions, he turned back to Rose, his expression softening. I'm sorry you've been dragged into whatever scheme this is, but I promise you, Rose, we'll fix this. You're not alone anymore. The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet certainty, broke something inside Rose, the careful walls she'd built around her heart since her mother's death. The stubborn self-reliance that had kept her going through months of grief and hardship. Tears welled in her eyes and she blinked rapidly, trying to contain them. Drew stepped closer, his expression concerned. Rose, I'm fine, she managed, even as a tear escaped to track down her cheek. It's just, no one's looked out for me like this since my mother died. I'd forgotten what it feels like to have someone on my side. Drew reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. The gentle touch sent a shiver through Rose that had nothing to do with fear or sadness. Get used to it, he said quietly. Because as long as you're at Silverleaf, you're family, and we protect our own. The conviction in his voice, the warmth in his blue eyes as they held hers, stirred something in Rose's chest, something fragile and hopeful that she'd thought long buried. Before she could examine the feeling too closely, however, Maggie returned to the kitchen. Billy's riding out to the Henderson place now, she reported. Judge Wilson should be here by tomorrow afternoon, weather permitting. Drew nodded, stepping back from Rose with what seemed like reluctance. Good. Until then, we go about our business as usual. I don't want Tate or that lawyer thinking we're concerned by their accusations. The rest of the day passed in a strange state of heightened tension beneath a veneer of normalcy. Rose continued her kitchen duties, preparing dinner alongside Maggie as if nothing unusual had occurred. Drew went about his ranch chores but remained closer to the house than was his custom, his protective instincts clearly engaged. That evening, Sheriff Tate and Blackwell accepted the invitation to dinner in the main house, an awkward affair, where polite conversation barely masked the underlying hostility. Rose felt Blackwell's calculating gaze on her throughout the meal, as if he were assessing a commodity rather than a person. It took considerable effort to keep her hands steady as she served the food. After the visitors retired to the foreman's cabin for the night, Rose helped clear the table in silence, her thoughts whirling with questions and fears. What if Judge Wilson couldn't help? What if they forced her to return to town to face false charges? The prospect of being separated from Silverleaf, from Drew and Maggie, and the sense of belonging she'd found here filled her with dread. Stop worrying, Drew said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the sink where she was washing dishes. Your face gives away your every thought. Rose sighed. Is it that obvious? Only to someone paying attention. He took the dish from her hands and began drying it with a towel, Judge Wilson is a fair man. Once he hears your story, he'll see through Tate's flimsy accusations. And if he doesn't, Rose couldn't help asking. Drew set down the dish and turned to face her fully. Then we'll fight it another way, but you're not facing this alone, Rose. I need you to understand that. The conviction in his voice, the intensity of his gaze as it held hers, made Rose's heart skip. Why? She asked softly. Why are you doing all this for me? You barely know me. Drew was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Because from the moment I saw you in that bakery, trying to sell your shawl with your head held high despite your circumstances, something told me you were special. He cleared his throat, seeming almost embarrassed by the admission. I don't have many certainties in this life, Rose, but I'm certain about you, about your character, your strength. The simple sincerity of his words touched Rose deeply. Thank you for believing in me, she whispered. It means more than I can say. It's easy to believe in what's right in front of me, Drew replied softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings that neither seemed quite ready to name. Finally, Drew stepped back, resuming his task of drying the dishes. We should get some rest, he said, his tone shifting to something more practical. Tomorrow's likely to be eventful. Later, alone in her room, Rose sat on the edge of her bed, running her fingers over the delicate pattern of her mother's shawl. The events of the day had left her shaken, but beneath the fear and uncertainty, a new emotion had taken root, a profound gratitude for having found her way to Silverleaf, and to the man who seemed determined to stand by her no matter what came next. What would you think of him, Mother? She whispered to the empty room. Would you approve? Though no answer came, Rose felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her mother had always taught her to trust her instincts about people, and everything in her instincts told her that Drew Nichols was a man worth trusting, perhaps even worth loving, if she dared to open her heart again. With that thought warming her like an embrace, Rose prepared for bed, determined to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring with the same courage Drew seemed to see in her. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sun glinting off fresh snow that had fallen overnight. Rose woke early, her sleep having been restless and filled with unsettling dreams of faceless men pursuing her across endless white plains. Despite her fatigue, she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, drawn by the comforting aroma of coffee and the need to keep busy. She found Drew already in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the stove. He looked up at her entrance, his expression softening. You're up early, he observed, straightening. Couldn't sleep, Rose admitted, moving to the stove to put on the coffee pot. Too much on my mind. Drew nodded in understanding. Billy returned late last night. Judge Wilson will be here by noon. Relief coursed through Rose at this news. Thank goodness. They worked together in companionable silence, preparing breakfast for the household and their unwelcome guests. As Rose kneaded dough for biscuits, she found herself watching Drew from beneath her lashes, the confident movements of his hands as he sliced bacon, the contemplative furrow of his brow, the way the early morning light caught in his hair. In less than a week, he had become central to her world in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. What will happen after this is resolved, she asked suddenly. With me, I mean, Drew glanced at her, his expression questioning. That depends on you. Do you still want to go to California? Rose considered the question carefully. The journey to California had been her plan for months, her hope for a new beginning after her mother's death. But now, standing in the warm kitchen of Silverleaf with Drew, the prospect of continuing westward held less appeal than it once had. I'm not sure anymore, she admitted. I came west seeking a home, a place to belong. I thought I'd find that with my aunt, but, Drew prompted gently when she trailed off. Rose met his gaze directly, but perhaps I've already found it here. Something flickered in Drew's eyes, hope, perhaps, or relief. Before he could respond, however, the kitchen door opened as Maggie entered, her expression concerned. Sheriff Tate and that lawyer are saddling up to leave, she reported. They're not waiting for the judge. Drew's jaw tightened. They're running. They know their story won't hold up to judicial scrutiny. He wiped his hands on a towel. I'll delay them. He strode from the kitchen, his posture rigid with determination. Rose and Maggie exchanged worried glances before following him outside. In the ranch yard, Sheriff Tate and Blackwell were indeed preparing to depart. Their horses were saddled, and Blackwell was securing his saddlebags with hurried movements that betrayed his anxiety. "Leaving so soon, Sheriff?" Drew called as he approached the men. "I thought you'd want to present your case to Judge Wilson personally." Tate's expression darkened. "Official business back in town, Nichols. Can't wait." More pressing than a suspected accomplice to the Harlow gang, Drew's tone was deceptively mild. Interesting priorities for a lawman. Blackwell stepped forward, his thin face pinched with annoyance. "We've wasted enough time on this matter. The stage company will pursue other avenues of investigation." "I'm sure they will," Drew agreed, "now that your attempt to frame an innocent woman has failed." "Frame." Tate blustered, his face reddening. "Now see here, Nichols." "No, you see here, Sheriff," Drew interrupted, his voice hardening. "We both know there was no James Wilson on that stage. We both know this so-called investigation is nothing but a fabrication meant to serve some other purpose." He took a step closer to the men, his stance subtly threatening. "What I don't know is who's pulling your strings. The railroad, the mining consortium, who stands to benefit from persecuting Miss Anderson?" A flash of panic crossed Blackwell's face before he could mask it. "These accusations are outrageous. The stage company is simply pursuing justice for a robbery that cost them considerable. Save your lies." Drew cut him off. "Judge Wilson will be here within hours. Why not stay and present your evidence to him? Unless, of course, you have no evidence that would stand up to judicial scrutiny." Tate and Blackwell exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for this direct confrontation. "This isn't over, Nichols," Tate warned, moving to mount his horse. "Oh, I think it is," came a new voice from the edge of the ranch yard. Everyone turned to see a distinguished older man on horseback, accompanied by Billy. The newcomer dismounted with the ease of a lifelong rider, despite his formal attire and silver-streaked hair. "Judge Wilson," Drew acknowledged with evident relief. "You're earlier than expected." "Good weather and an excellent guide," the judge replied, nodding toward Billy. He turned his attention to the sheriff and lawyer, his keen eyes narrowing. "Sheriff Tate. Interesting to find you here, particularly as I was informed you were urgently needed in town to deal with a disturbance at the Silver Dollar." Tate shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Just leaving, Your Honor. Got word of trouble back in town." "Indeed." The judge's skepticism was palpable. "And who might this be?" he asked, regarding Blackwell with obvious suspicion. "Walter Blackwell, Your Honor," the lawyer introduced himself with forced politeness. "Legal representative for the Western Stage Company." "Ah yes, the Stage Company. I received a most interesting telegram yesterday from their head office in Denver." Judge Wilson reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "It seems they have no record of employing a Walter Blackwell, nor have they authorized any investigation into the recent robbery near Elmwood Springs." The color drained from Blackwell's face. "There must be some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding," Judge Wilson interrupted sternly, "is your belief that you could perpetrate this fraud unchallenged." He turned to Tate. "Sheriff, I suggest you take this man into custody for questioning regarding false representation and attempted extortion." Tate looked trapped, his gaze darting between the judge and Blackwell. "Aye, that is. Unless, of course, you're implicated in this scheme yourself," the judge continued relentlessly. "In which case, I'll be forced to send for federal marshals to investigate both of you." "Now, wait just a minute," Tate protested, panic evident in his voice. "I was just following orders. Blackwell came to me with the statement, said it was all legitimate." "Throwing me to the wolves, Sheriff?" Blackwell's voice had taken on a desperate edge. "We both know who arranged this whole affair. Tell them about the telegram from—" "Shut your mouth," Tate hissed, reaching for his sidearm. Before he could draw, Drew moved with surprising speed for a man his size, grabbing Tate's arm and wrenching it away from the gun. In the ensuing struggle, Tate was pulled from his horse, landing heavily in the snow with Drew pinning him down. "That's enough," Judge Wilson commanded. "Hank, Charlie, secure these men. Separately, I want to hear exactly what each has to say without the other's influence." The ranch hands moved quickly to comply, disarming both men and escorting them to different buildings, Tate to the root cellar and Blackwell to the storage shed. Rose stood frozen on the porch, trying to process the rapid turn of events. Maggie's hand on her arm provided an anchor of support as Judge Wilson approached them, his expression softening as he regarded Rose. "You must be Miss Anderson," he said kindly. "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal." "Yes, sir," Rose managed to reply, still stunned by what had just transpired. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Justice delayed is justice denied," the judge replied simply. He turned to Drew, who had risen from the ground and was brushing snow from his clothing. "Mr. Nichols, perhaps we could continue this discussion inside. I believe there's much to be explained." Over the next few hours, the full story emerged through Judge Wilson's careful questioning of both Tate and Blackwell, conducted separately in the ranch's small office. Rose, Drew, and Maggie waited in the parlor, speaking little but drawing comfort from each other's presence. Finally, just as the winter sun was beginning its early descent, Judge Wilson joined them, his expression grave but satisfied. "It appears, Miss Anderson, that you were targeted not for any connection to the robbery, but because of your property in Missouri," he explained. "Blackwell isn't employed by the stage company at all. He works for the Transcontinental Railroad's Land Acquisition Division. They've been trying to secure a right-of-way through your property." "But why go to these lengths?" Rose asked, bewildered. "Why not simply approach me with an offer?" "Because your land has become considerably more valuable since you left Missouri," the judge explained. "Gold was discovered on adjacent property. The railroad wants your land not just for tracks, but for the mineral rights." "Gold?" Rose echoed in disbelief. "On our farm, potentially, yes. The railroad has been quietly buying up properties in the area while keeping the gold discovery secret." Judge Wilson's expression hardened. "When your mother refused their initial offer, they marked the property for special attention. After her death, they tracked your movements west, planning to approach you once you were settled in California." "But I was robbed before I got there," Rose murmured, the pieces falling into place, "and the deed was among my stolen possessions." The judge nodded. "Precisely. The robbery wasn't orchestrated by the railroad, but they learned of it and saw an opportunity. Blackwell was dispatched to recover the deed, forge your signature, and transfer the property to the railroad. Sheriff Tate was bribed to assist by discrediting you with false accusations if necessary." "So they were never going to arrest me?" Rose asked. "The whole thing was just to pressure me into leaving the area before their scheme was discovered." "That appears to be the case," the judge confirmed. "They didn't count on Mr. Nichols taking such a personal interest in your welfare, nor on my happening to be in the vicinity." Rose looked at Drew, who had remained protectively close to her throughout the judge's explanation. "You saved me in more ways than one," she said softly. Drew shook his head. "You would have seen through their plan eventually. You're too smart to be fooled for long." Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "Miss Anderson, while this matter is not fully resolved, I can assure you that both Tate and Blackwell will face serious charges. More importantly, your property rights remain intact, though the deed itself is still missing." "What does that mean for me practically?" Rose asked. "It means, my dear, that you are still the legal owner of a potentially very valuable piece of land in Missouri." The judge smiled kindly. "Once proper documentation is filed and your identity verified, you could sell the property for a considerable sum, enough to start fresh wherever you choose." The news was overwhelming. Rose had come west with modest means, seeking simply a place to belong after her mother's death. Now she faced the prospect of unexpected wealth and choices she had never anticipated. I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," the judge agreed. "These matters will take some weeks to resolve in any case." I'll be taking Sheriff Tate and Mr. Blackwell back to the county seat for formal charges tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest you remain here where you're safe until the situation is fully clarified." After Judge Wilson retired to the guest room Maggie had prepared for him, an expectant silence fell over the parlor. Maggie, sensing the need for Drew and Rose to speak privately, excused herself to check on dinner preparations. Left alone, Rose found herself struggling to articulate the tumult of emotions the day's revelations had stirred. Drew stood by the window, his profile outlined against the gathering dusk, his expression pensive. "It seems I'm not penniless after all," Rose said finally, breaking the silence. Drew turned to face her, a small smile touching his lips. "Apparently not. Does that change things?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. "Change things?" Drew repeated, his brow furrowing slightly. Rose took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Between us. Does it change how you see me, now that I might be?" "Well, relatively wealthy," understanding dawned in Drew's eyes, followed quickly by something that looked remarkably like hurt. "Is that what you think of me? That I valued you more when you needed help?" "No," Rose hastened to assure him, distressed by his reaction. "But circumstances have changed so dramatically. A week ago I was selling my mother's shawl for bread. Now I apparently own valuable property. It's a lot to process." Drew crossed the room to stand before her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Rose, when I saw you in that bakery, I wasn't drawn to you because you needed help. I was drawn to your dignity, your courage in the face of adversity." He hesitated, then continued more softly, "Those qualities don't change with your financial circumstances." Relief flooded through Rose at his words. "So much has happened so quickly," she admitted. "Finding Silverleaf, meeting you and Maggie, and now this." She gestured vaguely, indicating the day's revelations. "It's hard to know what to hold onto, what to believe in." Drew took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Believe in this," he said quietly, "in what we've built here in the past week. In what we could build in the future if you wanted to." The implication of his words sent a thrill through Rose. "Are you asking me to stay at Silverleaf permanently?" A flush crept up Drew's neck, but his gaze remained steady. "I'm asking for a chance to explore what's growing between us. Without pressure, without rush." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. "I know it's soon. We've known each other barely a week, but in that time you've become—" He trailed off, seemingly searching for the right words. "Important," Rose finished for him, understanding exactly what he meant because she felt it too, this strange, powerful connection that had formed between them so quickly yet felt so solid, so right. Drew nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Yes, important." The simple acknowledgement warmed Rose from within. "You've become important to me too," she admitted softly. "More than I thought possible in such a short time." Drew's smile transformed his face, erasing the worry lines that had creased his brow throughout the tense day. "So you'll stay?" "At least until spring." "I'll stay," Rose agreed, returning his smile. "After all, I promised Maggie I'd help with the baby, and I should probably learn more about cattle ranching if I'm going to be spending time in Colorado." The implication that her stay might extend well beyond spring wasn't lost on Drew. His hands tightened slightly around hers, his blue eyes warming with something that looked very much like joy. "I happen to know an excellent teacher," he offered, his tone lighter than she'd ever heard it. "Do you now?" Rose teased back, delighting in this new, playful side of him. "He's very patient," Drew continued, taking a small step closer to her. "Thorough in his explanations, dedicated to his students' success." "He sounds perfect," Rose murmured, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hands around hers, of the way his gaze had dropped to her lips. "Rose," Drew said quietly, "may I kiss you?" The formal request, so characteristic of his respectful nature, touched Rose deeply. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." Drew released her hands only to gently cup her face, his touch reverent as he drew her closer. When his lips met hers, the kiss was soft, questioning at first, then deepening as Rose responded with equal fervor. It was a perfect first kiss, tender yet passionate, a promise of feelings that ran far deeper than either had yet expressed. When they finally parted, Drew rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven. "I've wanted to do that since I draped your shawl around us both in that snowstorm," he confessed. Rose smiled, her heart full to bursting. "I've wanted you to since that same moment." Drew laughed softly, the sound vibrating between them. "We've wasted valuable time, then." "I wouldn't say wasted," Rose countered, her hands resting lightly on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Some things are worth waiting for, worth building slowly." The look Drew gave her then, full of tenderness and admiration, made Rose feel truly seen, truly valued in a way she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. It was a heady feeling, one she wanted to hold on to forever. "When spring comes," Drew said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, "we can decide together what comes next. Whether you want to sell your land in Missouri, whether you still want to visit your aunt in California." His expression grew serious. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Even if it means escorting you to Sacramento myself." The offer, made with such evident sincerity, confirmed what Rose already knew in her heart, that Drew Nichols was a man of honor, someone who would always put her well-being ahead of his own desires. It was this quality, perhaps more than any other, that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand all she couldn't yet put into words. Drew smiled and drew her into his arms, holding her close as the winter sun set beyond the windows, casting the parlor in soft golden light. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes that drifted past the glass like blessings. Rose thought of the shawl that had brought them together, her mother's final gift, which she had nearly sold out of desperation. Instead, it had led her to Drew, to Silverleaf, to this moment of unexpected happiness. Perhaps her mother was watching over her after all, guiding her path even from beyond. As Drew's arms tightened around her, Rose closed her eyes and allowed herself to simply be present in this perfect moment, grateful for the twist of fate that had led a desperate woman with a shawl to cross paths with a kind-hearted rancher on a snowy Colorado evening. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever decisions awaited in the spring, she knew with certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, home at last, wrapped in the embrace of a love as unexpected as it was profound.